and professional women, Pacifica, Rotary Wellington, and UNAMS New Zealand. So I'd like to greet you in our native tongue in New Zealand. Inga mana, inga reo, inga iwi. Inga rangatira mai, no mai, haere mai, piki mai. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia hui hui, katou katoa. In translation, all the peoples of the world, all speakers, all the chiefly peoples here, all groups, welcome, welcome, welcome. So this morning in New Zealand time, it's 11 o'clock, and it is my absolute privilege to be the facilitator of this very, very important conversation that we're going to have today. So without any further ado, we know that it's migrant and ethnic women taking the temperature of COVID-19 experience. So before we go any further into our panel and I introduce you to them all, I'd like to go through some very, very simple housekeeping rules. So with regard to the housekeeping rules, this is a safe place for sharing and exchange and knowledge and reflections. So please be kind and mindful of your presence, including respecting for others.
Can you hear that, Diane? Is that coming?
The session will be recorded and live streamed through Global Goals Institute YouTube channel. In the chat line, you will be able to see the YouTube, and please, we encourage you to share this. Otherwise, you're more than happy to turn it off. You're welcome to add your comments, questions, and your details in the chat box, both on the Zoom session and during the YouTube live stream. We will be following there. We will do our best to answer all of your questions. And during the period, we have a 30-minute Q&A session, and we have two of my wonderful co-hosts, Sharon and Guru, who will be monitoring the chat line in both YouTube and on Zoom to ensure that either they participate or feed these questions to me. So please think of the questions that you might have and don't be shy in putting them in the chat box. So it's my privilege, now that we've done the housekeeping, to actually start and introduce the incredible panels that we have actually lined up for you to talk about this very, very important topic that is affecting all our migrant and ethnic women in COVID. And whilst we think that COVID might be over for some of our countries, it is still very, very real as a topic, as a consequence to many of our women globally. So I would like to actually introduce you to our very first speaker, who is one of our human rights equal pay advocates here in New Zealand, who I have the privilege to not only know personally, but also in a professional manner, that we actually start working together in the women's empowerment principles. So the very first guest speaker is Dr. Saunoamaali'i Karanina Sumeo. Please, I ask you to come and take the floor.
Tēnā koutou, talawhalawa malo le sefua malo le langi mama, ko Saunoamaali'i Karanina Sumeo ahau, ko Equal Employment Opportunities, Women's Rights Commissioner ahau mo te kahui te tangata. It is my honor to be here with you today. We've all been through a really tough time, and I just want to send a big hello and much love to all our sisters and brothers online. It has been a difficult year, as Helen has said, for all of us. And we hope that at some point we will see the light whichever part of the world you're in. So I just wanted to say hello and send love and alofa to you all. March is also a very significant month for our homeland here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We just recently passed the second anniversary of very tragic events that happened that led to the significant loss of life amongst our Muslim whānau, brothers and sisters here. So I also want to acknowledge that not only for our Muslim communities in Aotearoa, but around the world, who are suffering from hate crimes and discrimination. I want to acknowledge that also. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. In terms of what's happening in New Zealand in the human rights space for our migrant women and our ethnic minorities, we have traveled to this land seeking opportunities as we do around the world. But we know as a result of COVID, women in particular have suffered the most if we look at it from a gender perspective. Certainly in New Zealand, the majority of job losses that resulted as a result of COVID has been suffered by women. And we know behind every woman is a household, and possibly behind us, there'll be children, people who rely on us. So the impact has been significant in Aotearoa as it has been around the world. And we know also that because the majority of part-time workers in our country, at least, are women, that the devastation has been significant. But we are hopeful. We are very hopeful that when we look at recovery programs, we want those programs to mean a recovery for everyone. There have been a few issues in our country where the initial response to COVID has been huge investments in jobs and apprenticeships related to infrastructure, building physical infrastructure. We know that also a lot of women are actually engaged in workplaces that are involved in social infrastructure. And myself and a number of our advocates around the country have been pushing our government to look at increasing investment in the social infrastructure, because we know that if they do that, that a lot more women working there can have more security in terms of their jobs, in terms of hours, and in terms of long-term income earning prospects, not only for our women, but for our young people who are coming through and looking at employment opportunities in social infrastructure. Recently, the Human Rights Commission conducted a number of research, and one of them was looking at the impact of COVID on discrimination suffered by our ethnic minority communities and our Asian communities included. It is no surprise to all of us that discrimination is embedded in institutions, in our legislation, in the way that we distribute investments, and so forth, right across the different sectors: health, education, employment, and so forth. And one of the findings that came out of that study, they've termed it an emotional armor, where our peoples have banded together to unify in order to counter the discrimination that they are experiencing. We see this amongst our young people in schools, and we're seeing it also amongst our peoples in the wider community, because through that unity, because of the shared experience of being victims of discrimination, resilience has come through. We've made efforts to negotiate more, to work with each other, to build our strengths and build our resilience. So that's very, very important research. It's not news to us who have suffered discrimination and ongoing marginalization, but it's a really important piece of research to put out to our wider community, so they are aware of the very real experiences that are suffered by ethnic communities and ethnic women included. Another piece of research that was conducted some time ago, a couple of years ago, by the Human Rights Commission, was looking at, and it's along the frame of gender equality and decent work and so forth, looking at people's experiences of unequal pay. And what that research pointed out clearly was that our new and our recent migrants to New Zealand, even when they find out that they're being paid unequally for the same amount of work using the same skills, same qualifications, that they don't complain. They don't tend to complain, and because they fear of upsetting their bosses and fear of retaliation. So it's not enough, therefore, to have laws that forbid these things, that forbid discrimination. We need to build trust in the system, so that our ethnic women and our minority groups trust that when they do lift their hands up, that they will be heard and there will be no retaliation as a response. And that is a piece of work that Human Rights Commission and others are working on. How can we make the system safer for people to complain? How do we make organizations more friendly to our new migrants? And how do we make those processes easier for them to navigate when they are uncovering injustices done to them? So we are continuing our efforts on that front. And I have to say, my time here as commissioner, perhaps because I'm a woman, because I am not European descent, that I do tend to hear more from our migrant and ethnic communities, especially our women, but also our men. So the traditional discourse about closing the gender pay gap is a journey that New Zealand is going on, and we're making progress. I think our gender pay gap is currently around 9%, just over 9%. But of course, then when we look beneath that average, the numbers are significant. If we're looking at our ethnic minorities, generally, the gap is around 13%. If we look at Pacific women, the gap varies between 22 and 27%, depending on whose data you're seeing. So it's a very, very unequal playing field that we're in, and we need to address that. We need to, I suppose, can we say, stop congratulating ourselves for achieving the average. We need to push harder, because there are many, many more women in our migrant and in ethnic minority communities who are not feeling that love of equality and living lives of dignity because it is beyond their means in this country. So those are areas that we're trying to work on here. Definitely, we're needing guidance from our communities themselves. So, for example, the Human Rights Commission just launched a national inquiry to look at why there's a significant pay gap between our Pacific peoples here in Aotearoa and the rest of society. The Pacific peoples are the lowest paid. It has been a prevalent pattern in Aotearoa for a long time. And yet we know that we are succeeding in qualifications. We are succeeding in completion rates of tertiary qualifications. So it does not make sense. And I don't buy this argument about the lack of qualification and lack of skill. So we need to ask those questions and explore, unfortunately, the issue of discrimination. It's very real. Nobody wants to be accused of discrimination, but if you don't know what you don't know, you need the public to tell you what you don't know. And that's one of the purposes of this inquiry. And we're hoping to talk with businesses. Now, the learnings out of that, even though we're focusing on Pacific, which is one group amongst our minority groups, I think the learnings will come from that will be useful in terms of any legislation changes that will actually benefit all of our ethnic minority communities, especially our women. So I'll leave it there for now, and happy to take questions later. But talofa again, and thank you very, very much for this opportunity for the Human Rights Commission to be here. Ia manuia.
Who's the director of the Global Goals Institute, and is the reason why we have the opportunity to present to this forum in New York, and it's incredibly exciting. So Barbara, please tell us about your research.
Thank you, Shirin. Kia ora, everybody. Warm Pacific greetings to you all. And thank you so very much for joining us. This is not my research. This is a research that has been going on since a while. And I will just provide you some of the feedback. This is a pilot study. We decided a few months back to carry out a pilot study on and taking the temperature in order to really start demanding a more just future while ensuring full participation of migrant and ethnic women in post-COVID responses and decision-making. We worked, excuse me, let me just start by telling you the story of how we started to get into this pilot study. And the story is how this initiative came about, its findings and action going forward. So during the first lockdown back in March of 2020 of last year, a group of scholars and practitioners decided to take the temperature of how migrant and ethnic women in New Zealand were dealing with the amplified challenges of COVID, and what were the challenges that they were actually facing in order to have their voices and their solutions put forward during the rebuild. This is what you see here is the team that carried out this pilot project. Anne, Emma, Gary, Shireen, myself, Barbara, and Sylvia. And we are all associates of the Global Goals Institute that actually is an initiative that was launched during COVID. So let's just look at the context of this pilot study. With only 10 years to go until the deadline to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the disruption that is being caused by the coronavirus pandemic is reversing decades of progress, particularly in gender equality. We know it. And it's actually reversing progress on decent work and economic growth and on reducing inequalities. So whether we really thought that it was important to understand how ethnic and migrant women were faring during this time. The aim of the project was to take the temperature, really understand how migrant and ethnic women here in New Zealand were dealing with the amplified challenges from COVID. The word migrant here in New Zealand has different meanings compared to elsewhere in the world. Many of our migrants actually here in New Zealand are considered to be people that have moved here and live in New Zealand in the past 30 years. And here, ethnicity is not defined by race, ancestry, nationality, or citizenship, but it's only a measure of cultural affiliation, which is quite important. In our pilot research project, we followed the definition of ethnic group, which here in New Zealand, for major ethnic groups, we mean European, Maori, which are the indigenous people of our country, Pacific peoples, peoples from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. The population that we targeted is migrant and ethnic women. The context and the methodology that we applied was quite a very informal type of conversation. And we just made up a number of friendship circles, and we had online conversation when migrant and ethnic women could discuss issues that were affecting their lives during COVID, and finding together possible actions or where needed, or where really, or where was the need to find solutions. The conversation provided very intensely a very, very safe space for women to just share their stories, their aspirations, their frustrations, and their passions. And really, there were a place where they could really express views and recognize, most importantly, their role as expertise in their own lives. The story that we heard repeat itself, and are really found pretty much elsewhere as well around the world. And we found out effects on unemployment, mental health and well-being, increased levels of family violence, but also we really found out a reflection on a sense of emerging voice and agency, which most migrants were really voicing up and letting us understand. So that the women started to share their stories. And these were so very powerful: employment, mental health issues, well-being, family violence, and a sense of emerging voice and agency was slowly but surely rising from this sharing. The three themes that came to the fore. The first one was challenges and around employment risks, about potential and current employment. Finding and retaining employment was a very, very big issue. In an environment with reduced job opportunities, issues like accents, or what about my age now, or what about the fact that I don't have specific skills, started to come forward more and more in the stories. We kept on hearing that like phrases like, we're not seeing the consequences of COVID yet for migrant women. We see the government protecting jobs for Kiwis. And so what about our untapped skills? What about, are these untapped skills going to waste? And we were actually perceiving the fact that migrant and ethnic women were fearing to really missing out on reduced job opportunities. And also by the fact that they could have been silenced, they could have not talked because of other issues that they were encountering. And this kind of feedback really matched very well the Sustainable Goals 8, which looks at decent work and economic growth and opportunities for all people. The second theme that came to the fore very strongly came out around mental health. In this category, women struggle with really hidden psychological and mental health problems. One of the main phrases that we kept on hearing was, should I stay or should I go? They were separated by from their families that they were overseas. Some of them had significant losses of people within their families, but they couldn't go because they could have not come back. The dilemmas, there were dilemmas on whether to stay, leave, go, join their beloved one overseas, but there were as well the reality of border closures. There were the reality of invisibility, of immigration type of issues, people that they were yet not holders of New Zealander passports, and so that they were not capable of joining their family in Brazil, in France, or in Asia. This challenges matched straight away with the Global Sustainable Goal number 3, which looks at good health and well-being for all human beings. The third theme that came to the fore, and one of the most delicate themes to actually have around when you have conversation, was the one of family violence. We know it is there, but we need to further experience it. We need to further discuss it. We understood that it was there. The research team, but the people, because of it's a delicate type of matter and is the scrounge of our society. And although the conversation really allowed a safe space to talk, this was a subject that was only mentioned in private circles. And we know that it's a problem here in New Zealand and deserves more attention, deserves solutions more than attention. But it's something that we need to keep on working on to understand and deep dive better on what kind of solutions migrant and ethnic women, together with other women, would like to see on this type of issue. But at this point of the story, as our pilot research was going on, we had an incredible positive turn. And we started to hear the stories, but we started to hear words like, we're seeking opportunities. We want to have recognized agency. We want our voices to be heard. We want to co-design for a better rebuild, and we want to be part of a country that has welcomed us. So despite these many challenges, discussants and the women noted that they were optimistic really about the future opportunities for themselves and for their families. This demonstrated a really strong desire to contribute to our community, acknowledging women's resilience and recognizing the enormous potential that migrant and ethnic women offer in New Zealand and actually in any adopted country. So the words were ones of resilience and optimism. We were seeing the strength of the people coming up, and they were strong regardless of the challenges, regardless of the fears, regardless of health issues. But the request was one: we want agency. We want to be able to be. We want to not anymore sit on the table. We have created our own table, and we want to invite everybody to join us in that table. So at that point, our research team took a step back, and it took a step back because here in New Zealand, the New Zealand government, our response to COVID-19 has been exemplar, has been recognized internationally. And the response of our government was fast, was clear, and has enabled COVID-19 to be managed at our borders with very limited community impact. We're very fortunate to be in this situation. Funds within the government were released to enable employers to pay employees through lockdown and emergency. Food packages were just shared around New Zealand, no matter what type of people we were. And they were provided across all communities. But despite this, New Zealand, and despite the fast response, migrant and ethnic women started to demand more and more action. And these actions, I provide right now a little bit of an overview of what the demand for action is starting to look like. Again, this is a pilot project, so that some of these action throughout the discussions, I mean, we understand that we are 25 years since Beijing, the Beijing Action Plan took place. And the people of our study started to demand system change, starting to say, we are leaders. We came here because we were wanted. Our skills were looked for from New Zealand. We want New Zealand to make use of our skills to transform our New Zealand, our region, and our world. Women were asking for an active role in the rebuild, not anymore to be consulted, but really in utilizing the skills that live within ourselves and the skills that we brought to this country to co-design and co-decide on different solutions going forward. So system change was the paramount type of feedback that we heard. System change in terms of accountability from government, accountability of data, accountability of having access to proper indicators, capability of follow-up and review of those data, and actually providing the control of such data, no longer into government agency, but in the hands of women's group across New Zealand, in order to gather, share, and follow up on that data. Another thing that we heard as action forward was the need of understanding the coherence and interlinkages with other international processes and human rights approaches. And so that on this side, part of our research will continue by mapping different binding and voluntary type of agreements, and just so that we can keep on holding our government to account, and so that we can really further human rights approach into gender equality here in New Zealand. Going forward, we are going to have a really active role, we hope so, in the rebuild and the co-design of a new world. And we will continue our conversations, and we will continue to collect the voices of ethnic and migrant women here in New Zealand. And we are going to be working collectively with other partners. So we are 4 speakers today, but there is a whole partnership, like Helen at the beginning said, of groups, women groups and civil society group that is going to join us going forward, to having more our voices heard and to share our voices. And we will, because the future really lies on working collectively. And actually we're going to be working with our partners, and we will start by joining forces with our Pacifica sisters. And we will start joining forces doing what my colleague Tofilau shortly will be discussing about doing talanoas, doing huis, gatherings, continuing our conversations together, building and exchanging knowledge, designing together better solution for a better and more just rebuild. So on this note, I would like to hand the presentation, a presentation that it's been prepared by many hands, not just by myself. And I would like to just end with a thought. The fact that we come to CSW, all of us come to CSW, because we want to change the laws, we want to change the policies to achieve equality. And CSW is the preeminent global policy space in which to do this. We come here to get in front of governments, our governments. It doesn't matter whether it's New Zealand, Brazil, Italy, Asia, whatever, any governments in the world. And we come here to come in front of our governments to ensure their political and financial commitments go where we want them to go, which is in women human rights. We also come here to build the global alliances between women activist organizations and feminists of the world. And we really come to CSW to create the change that we want. So on this note, I would like to extend a Pacific invite, the warmest I could ever do in a digital space. The Global Goals Institute and its partners are now looking to harness collective intelligence for innovation, creative solutions, and action going forward. So please join us. We'd be delighted to share with you knowledge, tools, frameworks, strategies, and laughter to build the future that we really want. Here at the end, there is all of our information, and there is my email. Please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. Thanks.
Kia ora, and thank you very, very much for that very, very insightful presentation, Barbara. And it's obviously going to cause a number of questions, hopefully in the chat line for you. So without further ado, we have another amazing speaker, Tofilau Bernadette Pereira, who is the National President of Pacifica Inc. in New Zealand. So New Zealand's 4th largest non-government organisation, and has worked widely in the public sector and the community. A community gender and youth development practitioner, Bernadette, for over 30 years. across the international, local and central government space. She's corporate and in the non-profit sector, she has a very loud voice. A large serving board member on a number of governance bodies, and as a chief advocate for women, youth and ethnic communities, having their voice, Bernadette's words closely with the communities advocating for a system where health, education, economic and social access is determined based on needs of community distributed equally. I can't wait to hear Bernadette's presentation. The floor is yours.
E ngā manga, e ngā reo, e ngā hauewha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, ngā mihi te wahine o tēnei rā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ki o rana ni Sampula Vinaka, kama Māori, halo ōketa, malo elelei, whakalofalahi atu, tāloha ni, namaste, malo soifo manuia, and warm Pacific greetings to everyone who is able to tune in from various parts of the globe. Talofa, talofa lala. I want to begin by telling a story. As a woman that was born, raised in the idyllic islands of Samoa and in the Pacific, was educated in my primary to secondary, and of course had the privilege and the opportunity to be educated at tertiary level in Australia, where I have also lived and worked across the Pacific and Aotearoa New Zealand in positions of international gender equality, community engagement and welfare. I would like to note 6 key points that really underpin the presentation to our issue today. I have found these points to be important for engendering change that is positive and wholesome and would be welcomed by all women of ethnicity that find themselves in Western societies and facing inequalities. Importantly, I'm not talking just about the impact on their individual well-being and prosperity, but that of their family, life, and significantly, the intergenerational losses of identity and empowerment that can and has wounded our children and infiltrated our communities. I will follow the 6 discussion points towards recommendations towards engendering equality for women of ethnicity that supports identity and empowerment. So firstly, I found through my work with that migrant and ethnic women of all races have a lot of commonalities to those of women of Pacific, all Pacific women. We all hold our information and knowledge through the process of observation through talanoa, sharing and telling our stories through utilizing our voices within the context of what is happening to us and around us. Our talanoa, or our voice, articulates with accuracy the expression of who we are, what we have to give, and what we need, and expresses how we have fared in this land of Aotearoa since our migration. As Pacific women, you will find we operate as a collective. Women's work is always completed and far outshines any work undertaken by bureaucracies. The meaning really is recognition of a collective action of women, which always yields great outcomes. As women, our identity and empowerment are as a collective. So as a collective, we share many experiences and give each other confidence and inspiration for varied opportunities, so that where we spring through to be amplified, fought for, and at times we have been able to find ways where we can see our sisters supported through the systems that are still divisive towards us. These systems are often used against us in our struggle to articulating and reaching our aspirations to achieve equal expression in a level playing field which all other citizens and women who now call Aotearoa New Zealand their home, rather than being disadvantaged because of our culture, heritage, language, and especially our need for a collective sisterhood. Women of ethnicity need to see opportunities for inclusivity, not individual promotion, to seek their strength in the collective of sisters open to discussion and familiarity, not invitations to forums of formality that seek a singular solution and omit the differences in need and aspiration with a collective or community. Sadly, in the Pacific space, our statistics don't always reflect or tell a balanced and rewarding story of our identity and how we can be empowered. You will rarely read a story of success that is culturally inclusive, although you may well of singular success of an ethnic woman who has immersed into the dominant Western culture. Our statistics are not owned nor analyzed by ourselves. It is time we own and analyze our own statistics and provide educational opportunities to our women to also utilize their statistical knowledge in interpreting our own solutions and how to gift our identity and actions to assist bring balance and healing to our world. The UN, as I know and has been through in the beginning, has met over the last 2 decades through CSW and has talked about gender equality then, and I'm afraid nothing much in the narratives have changed. Still now in 2021, we are confronted by the same conversations with the pendulum swinging away from migrant, Pacific, and ethnic women. But we remain alert because we have learned over time our critical mass occurs and a dream can become a reality and a new norm. With new solutions, some of the 6 discussion points can be in gender change. Our critical masses is really our point of difference here. That the resources already plowed into government institutions for the purpose of educating and harnessing skills for women to participate be redirected to Pacific women organizations, migrant women's organizations, and groups that are able to discuss to talanoa. That all exist already and are in our communities. We need, however, to be cognizant and to recognize, to remove intermediary bodies and allow direct interaction and discussions with Pacific, ethnic, and migrant women directly to government and at all levels of decision making. Here, we will see identity empowered and groups being able to interpret our own solutions. Key concerns I have are for the strategies and economic plans for education and health of Pacific, ethnic, and migrant women. These should be led by the women who know better what is good for creating jobs that will be taken up, exploring creative and innovative and cultural knowledge strategies that best represent these groups. Transformative actions led and co-designed by women of Pacific and ethnic groups in Aotearoa New Zealand hold our solutions to equality. We need to see more encouragement and funding for more collaboration of the Pacific migrant women to sharing their collective wisdom, their skills that will improve and provide sustainable jobs, real jobs, well-paid employment so that they can assist their families and their communities. Women know what families need. Families are crucial in the societies of Pacific and ethnic populations, and their welfare is understood best by women. It is the voice of our women that can liberate their own people from the inequalities that are experienced daily. Ia soifua ma ia manuel tatou whanutanga. Tofilau, Bernadette, Pereira.
And it's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Mari Claude. who is the immediate past chair of ECOSOC in Paris. She's a friend, a bit of a mentor, and has absolutely a strong voice when it comes to education and climate change. Marie-Claude, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm not from ECOSOC. In fact, I'm from UNESCO, which was the first UN agency to be created after the United Nations for science, education, and culture. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I looked at the chat and I saw all the issues around ethnic. That was one of my questions too. So I'm very happy. So I guess what I'm going to present now is something from my ethnic European background. And it's not working, is it?
Yes, it is. Yes.
How do I get to the next one? Okay, thank you. So as you've already said, and you know certainly this quote from the Executive Director of UN Women, women are the unsung heroes of this crisis. So we certainly share all this between each other here and from over the world, I think. So with the current crisis, women assume more domestic tasks and their jobs are also disproportionately affected by the COVID. Such impacts risk reversing, as you already said, the already fragile gains in women's labor market participation, limiting women's ability to support themselves and their families, especially for single female-headed households. This has been particularly abrupt in the service sector, retail trade, hotels and tourism, the government sector, where women are overrepresented. The situation is worse in developing economies where the vast majority of women's jobs are in informal economy. The socio-economic impact of the pandemic will likely lead to more poverty and unemployment, especially in the informal sector, which consequently could increase the migratory potential. COVID-19 has posed an existential threat as well as a health threat to the world's indigenous peoples. They are at disproportionate risk during health crisis, a particular risk of experiencing food insecurity due to a changing climate and years of losing local knowledge. All of this has been further exacerbated in the wake of the pandemic, serving as a reminder of the fragile balance between human and natural environments. Yet there is also an extraordinary level of resilience among indigenous people born from the continued custodianship they provide for land, biodiversity, agroecology, and natural resources. Yet, according to UN Women data, only 1 country in 8 worldwide has established measures to mitigate the economic and social impact of the crisis on women and girls. COVID-19 impacts men and women differently and may create greater inequalities, particularly for vulnerable people like migrants, whose majority are female. Can you change the slide? Okay. So at UNESCO, with the NGO partners, there has been a spontaneous solidarity group among which the International Federation of Business Professional Women, which I represent to UNESCO, Make Mothers Matter, ATD First World, the International Forum for Reconciliation and Peace, OMEP, the Childhood World Education, AMI Montessori, South Asian Foundation, and the Catholic International Cooperation with UNESCO. So from the outset of the global pandemic, 8 NGO UNESCO partners decided to collaborate together with their local associations in solidarity actions to share the voices of the most vulnerable and to understand the changing situation on the ground. The exchanges on the Facebook solidarity pages opened on all continents rapidly enabled interconnection between local associations and reliable feedback to international NGOs. The project was based on real situations experienced by people on different continents and spontaneous initiatives to fight the pandemic emerged and were relayed locally and globally. So we had an article posted on the UNESCO website, and which is entitled Exploring New and Innovative Responses to the Crisis. Next one, please. So I'm going to talk about violence against women and empowerment too during COVID. Of course, violence against women is a matter of extreme urgency, and long before the crisis even began, it was already estimated that 35% of women worldwide had suffered physical or sexual violence from their intimate partner or from someone else. Gender-based violence affects all regions worldwide and is grossly underreported, both in stable contexts and in emergencies. BPW International is committed to combating systemic overexposure of women to violence by assisting victims and advocating government. Following the consecutive closures of supermarkets on the island of Barbados in the Caribbean, BPW, which runs a women's shelter and has been doing so for a long time for domestic violence victims, ran out of food. BPW Barbados therefore formed an alliance with local women farmers to source and prepare meals for the women at the shelter. BPW also contributes to women's empowerment by supporting them in the economy and in health, of course, more particularly during the COVID-19. And all these actions and synergy were reported in a booklet and this solidarity project to UNESCO. During the COVID-19 crisis, BPW also advocated with governments to develop responses to COVID-19 redesigned from a gender perspective to suit women's specific needs. Next, please. So in these actions that were implemented, there was this one by an association indigenous in Argentina called Movimiento de Mujeres Indígenas por el Buen Vivir. So they promote the rights of indigenous women disproportionately affected because of their important role in the informal economy. And this is a matter of urgency. Civil society organizations, that's this one, are working to achieve this goal of promoting the rights of indigenous women. And in a campaign, the movement denounces the persistence of Chino, the rape of girls, boys and women of indigenous nations by Creole men. One of the campaign posters relayed on social networks with the hashtag Basta de Chino asked, did you know that in Argentina, when even today, Creole men rape, torture, and killed indigenous women and girls? Next one, please. There's also the story of these children and girls and women too in Colombia and La Garija in the northern point. Communities have 80% in extreme poverty, and more than 20,000 mothers are heads of families. And that was before COVID. They are between 15 and 20 years of age, and they have 1 to 4 children. Their level of education is primary school, and 10% of them have not even completed primary school level. 250,000 children, half of them living in rural areas and from ethnic origins, from other origins, and they have no access to internet. Wau, one of the indigenous groups, feel insecure, and 50% of the young mothers say they don't have the opportunity to express themselves, and 60% do not participate in public or community life. And we know that there are lots of migrants who also come from Venezuela, and they complicate also the context of already extreme poverty and violence. Next, please. So I wanted also to talk to you about UNESCO engagement with indigenous people. So it's a human rights-based approach for the self-determination, participation, and free, prior, and informed consent. It's about education and development with a culture and identity. It's about the conservation and protection of the environment. It's also about equality and non-discrimination approach, about cultural heritage, knowledge and languages, and as a cross-sectoral gender equality. Next, please. So the UNESCO sets standards instrument, and one of these instruments, which is very useful to empower women and girls, whether ethnic or indigenous and European like me, is the Convention Against Discrimination, the first internationally legally binding instrument covering the right to education extensively. So this convention expresses the fundamental principle of non-discrimination, prohibiting any discrimination, distinction, exclusion, limitation, or preference based on race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, economic condition of birth, and of course we're talking also about migrants. So, and we are celebrating 60 years of saying no to discrimination. And I don't know if you knew about it, but today at UNESCO, there was the Global Forum on discrimination and racism. Thank you. Next one. So we have also cross-cutting policy and strategy news at UNESCO. So the strategy on human rights, the priority on gender equality, with the women and girls leading the charge to ensure that learning never stops during COVID. And this webinar will be held on the 24th of March. There's also the operational strategy on youth. There was this youth report which could be of interest to you on migration, displacement, and education. The title was Bridging Bridges, Not Walls. There's also the strategy for action on climate change, education in emergencies, talking about migration and conflict, education to global citizenship and sustainable development. There will be a global meeting in Berlin in September on this, in particular, on this education to sustainable development. There is also the ICAR, which is the cities, inclusive cities welcoming refugees and migrants, and there are around 400 cities which are called inclusive and against discrimination and racism. And there's also the policy on engaging with indigenous people dating back to 2017. Next one, please. So what are the actions of UNESCO? UNESCO supports multilingual education based on mother tongue. I saw that multiculturalism was included in the curricula in New Zealand. It was included in 2010. There's also the local and indigenous knowledge systems, which you may be aware of. And you have the Kano is the People, which is a links educational resource on ocean wayfinding in the Pacific, available in Maori and English. Next one, please. So my recommendations can't really be a sin. I would recommend to advocate for the right to inclusive and equitable quality education for all since the very beginning to lifelong learning. Of course, advocate for human rights, promote the rights of women and indigenous people as custodians of our environment. We should also refer to the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity to help preserve and promote cultural diversity worldwide. This declaration aspires to enhance the recognition of cultural diversity, the awareness of the unity of humankind, and the development of intercultural exchanges to help preserve and promote cultural diversity worldwide. This Universal Declaration aspires to enhance the recognition of cultural diversity, the awareness of the unity of humankind, and the development of intercultural exchanges. The Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage recommendation concerning the promotion and use of multilingualism and universal access to cyberspace, Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Cultural Diversity. So also stand in solidarity against racism, sexism, and discrimination, and empower women and see them as agents of change. That has already been said. And nous ne sommes pas des victimes, mais nous sommes des résistantes. And we are agents of change. Thank you very much.
Marie-Claude, thank you for that very, very comprehensive and global view that you've given us, and lots of food for thought, absolutely. And, you know, just talking about those events that are coming up, that for many of us that are possibly in the forum here today would find, yes, they will put them in their diary and make the attendance, because very critical topics and very timely at the moment. So thank you. And come back. I'm actually going to ask the three panelists that have presented, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask them some questions. So I'm going to go back to our Human Rights Commissioner on Equal Pay in New Zealand, Dr. Karanina. So with regard to the stats and the information that you were talking about and the information you were gathering, particularly around our Indigenous people, Māori and Pacifica, when it came to some of the social structures that they were having problems, or that we were hoping that the government would be able to address in a better way. Karanina, can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that for myself and the people that are in the room with us?
I'll just unmute myself. Sorry about that, everyone.
Sorry, I had you on the spot. You thought you probably had a little bit longer, but I do apologize.
That's all right. That's all right. Yes, I mean, COVID is everywhere around the world of our Indigenous peoples and our new migrants to any newly adopted homeland. You know, COVID just exacerbated, you know, pre-existing inequities, and we're all trying to run at 100 miles an hour to make sure that we don't actually return to that and actually do better. So, you know, in terms of our Indigenous women, there is a national inquiry looking across all areas of life, and looking not only at hearing the stories, but looking at remedies, you know, in terms of what our Indigenous women identify as appropriate remedies to address those inequities and those violations of human rights. As I said, in terms of our Pacific women, and the inquiry is going to be hearing their voices in terms of what they think would be the appropriate ways going forward. And of course, the answers and the abilities to remedy human rights violations don't just lie upon the victims. You know, it's about holding the whole system accountable. So we're talking to businesses, of course, we're talking to government, and we're talking to other organizations. I mean, the human rights the United Nations review of New Zealand's human rights commitments back in 2018 did identify specific things, and they asked for specific things at the next reporting, including measures, for example, in terms of increasing the number of our ethnic minority women and our Indigenous women and Pacific women through the public service, you know, because it's only when we lift our incomes that we can have any hope of closing that vertical gap in income. So, and to this, at this moment, I have not yet seen what those measures are.
Right. So
we are pressuring government to introduce targets, because when you have targets, then people think differently and operate differently. But without targets, nothing really changes, as we know, because what comes with targets is additional investment to address these inequities. And that's what we want to see. In order to benefit our women, because we benefit our women, we benefit our households, our families, and communities. So that's just a sort of brief response to your question, Helen.
I have a question for you. It's really wonderful that the pathway has been set with regard to the Voice of Global Women doing this particular survey and starting to talk and highlight the importance of the conversation around migrant and ethnic women. So it was great to identify the needs and what were the specific needs going through COVID-19. And I can certainly understand and appreciate the dilemma, particularly for those that had chosen New Zealand as their country and feeling distant and probably in a boat out to sea when it came to thinking of those loved ones that they had left in other countries globally. So when we looked at the remedies and the pathway going forward, the silver lining of COVID, can you elaborate a little bit more on what did they prioritise the things that they felt that the New Zealand government and their local communities should do to help support them to get through this COVID-19 that we're all experiencing? Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. It's a very, very good question, actually. Yes, I think that what came out, or what we actually uncover, is the fact that it's what the Human Rights Commissioner has already provided some background around, is that although we do live in a wonderful country and we're very lucky to have fared COVID the way that we did, there is still a silent type of discrimination that that is part of the colonial skin and make of the country. Now I guess that we need, possibly one of the action going forward is to find other ways to have this conversation, understanding how integration will work moving forward for us to become one human being. And I'm using the word very carefully, really, because that's what we are, human beings, where each and every person that is coming to this country, whether it's a skilled migrant, or whether because of education type of opportunities, or because it has been joined in marriages, men, women, or partners from around the world and coming here to New Zealand, would like to have an equal opportunity to share the knowledge, the skills, the academic skills, and the values that we bring into this country. I mean, it's not easy. It takes a lot of courage to go to a new country. In the new country, you embrace it with the best of your capabilities. And then when you arrive to a country, you really understand that it's not all a bed of roses, New Zealand included, and that we need to live together. We're a country of only 5 million, and we could be really doing fantastically well. We should be having no poverty, no inequality, no gender inequality, no kids that are struggling, no women that have been beaten as we're speaking, because that's one of the awful type of numbers that we have in New Zealand. So to answer your question, Helen, it's really I'll answer your question with another question. What has been done in the past maybe has not worked quite right. And maybe the pandemic has opened a portal to a new beginning. So how can we all here in New Zealand reset the rule, starting with the strength of all of us, civil society, people, individuals, working alongside government, local government, friends, families, and really set the example here in New Zealand to become human beings that really are holding each other's hands.
Barbara, thank you very, very much for answering the question, and typical of you, because I do know you, to answer a question with a question. So I'm going to pick up that gauntlet and I'm going to actually pass the baton on to Marie-Claude, in the sense that, Marie-Claude, there was a lot of work done by UNESCO when they reached out globally to a lot of people, and the feedback that came through the Facebook and the many virtual platforms around the globe, where people put their hand up and said that they were facing many issues. So what were, if you were to prioritize what those top 3 issues were, across the globe. Would you be able to articulate that and share that with us? Because I know that there must have been an awful amount of pouring in of information from around the globe, from different perspectives. So was it loneliness? Was it mental health issues? Was it the lack or the inability for them to connect? Was it around work? Was it fear of finances and economic position? Could you just give us a bit of a breakdown of what you felt would have been the top 3 issues that these people felt?
Well, the first thing was the problem with the closure of schools, because, UNESCO has the first mandate for education. So that was terrible. And around this, we have been working with lots of NGOs in solidarity, because it was the problem with the early childhood. They were lost and they could not, with the mask, and it was so difficult. And then you had problems also with the families, because kids had to stay at home and they couldn't get internet, they couldn't get access, or the families didn't understand, or the families, some of them would be violent too. So there was also this problem of violence. There was also the problem of the poorest of the kids. They couldn't eat, because very often the poorest, they go to school and they have at least 1 meal a day, but they couldn't eat, And there was also this problem with the culture and with the artists, and also with the Lebanon. In Lebanon, the situation is terrible. And so we try to also create synergy and stand in solidarity with other NGOs, because also of the closure of schools, and also because of the bomb that was there, and because of the political problems. So yes, there are all kinds of problems, but of course, because there is the mandate for education first, and then science too. There was so much fake news. So they did a lot, against the fake news, the misinformation. And, in our solidarity group, there was this story of a youth in Ivory Coast, in Abidjan. They destroyed a place where they sort of shelter where they had medicines, because they said that it was to poison the people. So they just ruined down the shelter, for these medicines and for also vaccines, So quite a lot of issues, but of course, education, health, culture, and violence also. That women and girls are one top priority. So this is very important too.
Marie-Claude, thank you very, very much. It's good to understand that, and I can have empathy for part of the answer that you gave us, being in a house of 3 generations with grandchildren that range from the age of 6 to 10, and having to think about how we were going to continue their education so that we didn't lose any ground. I know that there are a few questions. I'm going to hand over to Guri and say, Guri, could you please put some of the questions in the chat box to our panelists, please?
Kia ora, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes, okay, good. We do have a question. One of them is, and this is to all of the panelists, so please feel free to respond if you feel spoken to. What initiatives did UNESCO take in partnership with MMM and OMEP on behalf of migrant and ethnic minority women and young girls? So what initiatives did UNESCO take in partnership with MMM and OMEP on behalf of migrant and ethnic minority women and girls? Thank you.
So I guess it's for me.
Yes.
Right. Well, in fact, concerning migrants, I can't say really, because we get together, the NGOs got together spontaneously in response to COVID-19, because we realized that the people, the local people, didn't know what was happening. There was a lot of fake news. They didn't have any soap. And so we decided that we would create sort of connection between them and also relay the information to the member states and the National Commission. And that's how it started. And thanks to that, you know, people from all the continents could, and from the local regions to the national and international regions could connect together, because they felt isolated and they didn't know what was happening really. So this was the idea of this solidarity project. Now about partnership between UNESCO, for example, and MMM, I know that they have been working on Afghanistan for the girls going to school in Afghanistan, and they set up a project with UNESCO and MMN. I don't know if you've heard of it, and it's called Raise a Pain, for Afghanistan girls to be able to go to school, because you know there it's quite a problem for girls and even women. So that's it. And now for this project of solidarity, it's a sort of a good practice for NGOs to get together and be able to help each other. And you know the story I told you about Venezuela and Argentina, that comes from MMM.
Do any of our other panelists want to make a comment with regard to that question put, or would you prefer us to go to a second question from the chat line? I think, Guri, it's over to you for a second question from the chat line, please.
Sure. One thing that I'd just like to let Bernadette know, there have been quite a few people very interested in your presentation, Bernadette. And so if you could please just type in your key messages in the chat box for everybody, they can then see the information that you were going to present. Oh, there she is. I can see her again. Lovely. Bernadette, if you could just please type in your key messages in the chat box. And if you'd like to, you can send to Global Goals Institute. We'll be in touch with you. You can just send us a video, and then we'll be able to upload that as well, so that everyone can see and hear the messages that you would like to present today. So just to let everybody know that as well. And there was a question for the Commissioner, Commissioner Karanina, about initiatives in the Pacific space for women and girls, in particular around COVID-19 responses. Thank you.
Myself. So I know that the Pacific Business Trust, so this is in the context of Aotearoa, have set up a fund to look at encouraging young entrepreneurs. It's not specifically targeting women, but for young entrepreneurs generally. So there might be things like that are happening around. Certainly, when it comes to investment in infrastructure by government, I have pressed to have targets for women generally, as well as for Pacific and Indigenous peoples and peoples with disabilities. If you know, that will include all peoples, but I'm hoping that they're looking at lifting the number of women. The other thing I ask them is, you know, if women do take up apprenticeships in these trades, you know, we need to make sure that they're safe. And I'm thinking in terms of safe from bullying and sexual harassment in particular. Those are big problems here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I don't know what it's like for the rest of the world, but it's a shameful occurrence that happens. It is violence towards women in the workplace. So that's one of the things that I'm battling for alongside others. I saw one of the questions there on the list about the impact of COVID on migrants. Certainly from my perspective as a Commissioner for Equal Employment Opportunities, and Marie-Claude, you talked about the informal sector. So one of the things that really happened is for some of our members in our migrant communities, and by migrant, I'm a migrant. I arrived here 40 years ago, but I still consider myself a migrant. My children are not because they're born here, but that informal sector, because they found it hard to break into formal jobs, so they set up their own small businesses and so forth. Unfortunately, for some of them, they weren't set up, they weren't registered formally. So when their businesses crashed and they lost income, they couldn't apply for government subsidies, for wages for their staff and so forth. So they fell through the gap. And as a result, they lost everything. I know I picked up the phone and called one of my colleagues who works for the local council. She's in the Chinese community, and she said some people just walked off their businesses. They just abandoned them. So huge devastation for our migrant communities. And Helen, that amongst our migrant women who set up their businesses, in the cities, and then with everybody working from home, there weren't so many people going and buying that coffee or buying that lunch, during breaks. And the devastation is huge. I work in Auckland City, our biggest city here in New Zealand, and I walk up and down our Queen Street, our main street, and you see the number of businesses that have closed down. So this recovery is going to take a long time, but for some people, they've already lost everything, especially for our migrant peoples who have invested everything they had. So it's not as visible as it needs to be, and we need to give it attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think, Helen, do we have time for just one more question, comment?
Absolutely, because then I will wrap up and address some of the questions that are in there from my perspective as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. One question / comment is that there is a lot of praise for the collaboration that the attendees are seeing. So that's wonderful. And please do get in touch with everyone else who is on this platform. We'd all love to hear from each other, I'm sure. But one of the questions is around that collaboration and the fact that so many people in civil society who are able to connect are actually in quite privileged positions. So from those privileged positions, how can we make an impact with those who perhaps do not have a voice or perhaps do not have access to resources in order to have their voice heard? Thank you.
Look, thank you very much. And it's kind of coming to the end where I have this wonderful opportunity of closing up. But what I would like to do is just give a bit of context in the sense that through COVID-19, I work with very, very closely 230 businesses, and it is just a little place north of Wellington, which is our capital city, so at the bottom of the North Island. A third of the businesses of those 230 are migrant people. Some of them are second generation, some of them are third generation, but their culture is very much alive, and they rely on, whilst they speak English, their understanding and reading is not always comprehended. And this is where we as Indigenous and Europeans native to New Zealand forget that we hear a spoken vocabulary, but don't appreciate that the written is not so good. So one of the pose or positions that I did working with those people was to ensure that any portal that the government put out, that on that platform, all of the translation, all the different languages were first, that those of us that spoke New Zealand or Kiwi or English, we knew to scroll down a website. Our migrants, our ethnic people didn't know that. So we needed to make sure that it was accessible. The wonderful thing about the NGOs in New Zealand, they were able to have an in to the government through the various ministries to actually get that corrected quite quickly. But whilst we were encouraging them to go from a door-to-door shopfront platform to a virtual platform, it was not easy to do that in a very short time. And we're still making them resilient in the sense that we are now moving them so that they have a virtual presence as well as a street presence to ensure that they can continue and be sustainable in their business and their offering. We also tapped into many of the NGOs locally in our area to be the conduit to make sure that through the different Chamber of Commerce or business networks and the government, that they knew what they were entitled to and that they had access, because it was always with our migrants and our different ethnic groups, it was you didn't know what you didn't know. So you relied on someone to be able to show you or tell you what you didn't know. And unless you had empathy or someone that had been here, and the downfall for us as Kiwis in New Zealand is that we have wonderful classes and education programs for those that come and choose New Zealand as their country, but we do not educate our own people to embrace that culture and to have an understanding of what our responsibility is when we welcome them to New Zealand. So that's my kōrero on the subject, but I would like to thank our 4 amazing panelists for coming along. It's always a privilege to have our equal rights employment person, Dr. Karanina, with us. She's a privilege and she is a breath of fresh air. We thank Dr. Barbara Bedeschi Lewando for instigating and be fearless enough to put this forum together through Global Women to amplify and put a light on what is definitely a global issue, not just a New Zealand issue. I want to thank Bernadette, even though we went through some challenges. It's great to know that those that were in the room want to hear what your points are. So please, maybe Sharon, being the director of filmmaker, might be able to come and visit you from her lovely island in Waiheke to come and video you so we can share. But to our international guest, Marie-Claude, thank you for your contribution, your global look through the eyes of UNESCO to put a global perspective in the conversation that we're having here in Aotearoa. I just want to thank you all for your time. And what I would like to do is I would like to close with a proverb, which is a New Zealand proverb, and it's "Ha piti te ao tika panu, a tia arangatiratanga mo nā u wakatipu." And what it basically means is foster the pathway of knowledge to strength, independence, and growth for future generations. Ngā mihi mai, thank you all for participating in this very, very important conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, Manuia. Safe journeys, everyone.
Kia ora. Hey, can I suggest that if people are still here, they take their videos off and we just have a wave and I'll do a couple of screen grabs? I think that would be really nice. So take your video off, everyone, and have a wave. Oh, cool. Okay, I'm just going to take a picture. Wonderful. Thank you all for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
I'm hoping that we get back to those of you that have posed questions and we have not been able to answer them. But once again, our appreciation and much aroha from us here in New Zealand.